Hello and welcome to an essay plan that is going to compare Poppies with Remains. This video will show you how to compare the two poems effectively. There's lots of videos that will do a really good job of analysing each poem in isolation, which is important, but that is only step one. Step two is to compare the two poems, which means to write about their similarities and their differences. That is what the examiner wants. So this video will go through a number of sentence starters for a number of separate paragraphs, give you evidence to back each of these up, and importantly, link back to the keyword in the question. If the paragraphs don't link back to the keyword, then the question is not being answered. If the question is not being answered, you're not going to get the marks. Okay, so you're in the exam, you've opened your paper, and what is written at the top here, almost, is the question you have to write an essay on. How are ideas of the after effects of war portrayed in Poppies and, let's say, in this case, Remains? Now you can compare Poppies and Remains with whatever poems you want, but I personally can just about imagine comparing these two quite effectively. So that's what I would do, and this is how I would go about planning my essay. Point number one. The after effects of war reduce people to a fragile state in different ways. What's my evidence for that from Poppies? Well, I think we would all agree that there is a, one might say, lexical field of patchwork imagery that runs throughout the poem. So much I don't know where to begin. Line 4, I pinned a poppy onto your lapel. Line 5. A blockade of yellow bias into line 6, the reference to sellotape in stanza 2, but perhaps most powerfully for me and most usefully for me in my essay, line 28, the verbs tucks, darts and pleats, which I understand are all actions that one would do when one is sewing. So this consistent reference to patchwork imagery and, as it were, metaphorically sewing herself back together rather implies an attempt to metaphorically repair herself due to the trauma she has faced about, it is heavily implied, losing her son as a result of war. I would furthermore, in addition, examiner, refer you to the line where she released a songbird from its cage in line 24, which is surely a metaphor for her walking into the empty bedroom and, as it were, crying inconsolably. The reference to a bird implies something that is graceful, that is light, and therefore surely is ultimately quite fragile, generally speaking. I'm aware that there are quite vicious predatory birds, but I don't think that that would necessarily be in the poet's mind when she wrote the poem. And I think most powerfully, everybody, if my idea is all about being fragile and about being easily breakable, and of course, having just talked about that patchwork imagery, something that can be sewn together, perhaps implies it has been ripped, or indeed it could easily be ripped once again, I come to the simile towards the very end of the poem, the reference to the fact that in line 32 she leans against the war memorial like a wishbone. We, I'm sure, all know that a wishbone is a particular bone that you would have in your Sunday roast, and that were you to break it with somebody else, your wishes may come true. So a wishbone is something that is ultimately very easily breakable, that is fragile therefore, and it's obviously closely related to the idea of wishing. So fragility in two ways. On one hand, the idea of comparing herself to a very easily breakable and therefore fragile bone, but on the other hand, considering its symbolism is so intimately conjoined with the idea of wishing, we have to presume that this adds another layer of fragility to that meaning. So I would hope, everybody, that that would give me well over half a page worth of writing, and I haven't even compared it to Remains yet, and that's where I'm going to go now. This is similar to the poem Remains, where we have an attempt to conceal the fragile nature towards the beginning of the poem with a lot of casual language that is concealing his inner conflict. We hear about line 1, the poem beginning in media res. On another occasion, line 2, tackle. Line 5, this vague cumulative list of myself and somebody else and somebody else. Line 7, all three of us open fire, three of a kind. All of this I'm suggesting, everybody, of course, I should also refer to stanza 2, the image of mates and toss his guts back into the body, suggest a slightly casual attempt to describe the trauma of the war zone that the soldier has just returned from. This is very casual language, this is informal language, and everybody, it's also language that's to do with playing a game. I've hit this looter a dozen times, three of a kind. They're to do with card games. The reference to tackle in line 2. So here is somebody I'm suggesting that is trying to use quite casual language to conceal the fragility. Unlike the poet in Poppies, sorry, I should say the protagonist in Poppies, who is attempting to repair themselves, this person is trying to conceal it. A subtle difference that I think the examiner would appreciate. However, we know in the second half of the poem, as the language becomes much more unsettling and unpleasant, which ultimately culminates surely in the final line of his bloody life in my bloody hands, an intertextual reference to Macbeth, Act 5, Scene 1, where she refers to having blood on her hands, a metaphor for not being able to wash away the metaphorical guilt that one may feel after having had a hand in somebody else's misfortune. That clearly all of that casual language at the beginning was an attempt to conceal something far more traumatic towards the end. I think, everybody, if I were to start writing that up into a paragraph, doing what the examiner wants by referring to technical terms like adjective and simile, lexical field, analysing the effects of all that language and comparing it quite nicely, that I hope I've got over a page of writing by now. So, paragraph 2, point number 2, I would start off slightly overlapping, but I hope it's rather distinct enough that it can still be a different point, by claiming that there is a relative success and failure of repairing the damage that has been done in both poems. What I mean by that is there is some success in Poppies with regards to how she repairs herself emotionally, but sadly there is a great deal of failure in Remains as to how successful he has been in repairing himself. What's my evidence for this? Well, through Poppies, I would refer again to this semantic field of sewing, or this semantic field of patchwork repair that runs through the poem. Now, I've mentioned a fair amount already in the first, or in support of the first point. Happily, there is just so much running through this poem that I can refer to other bits and bobs. So in this particular case, I would refer to the verbs in line 17, the use of the verbs flattened and rolled and turned into felt. The idea that her words are somehow intimately linked with the idea of preparing a fabric that by implication is being used to sew up something or to produce something that is attractive, a nice jumper, for example, but also perhaps a fabric that is being used to fill a hole somewhere in something. So the use of those verbs, I think, would help support this, as well as in line 34, when we have a slightly complex metaphor towards the end of a dove that we first see in stanza 3 being referred to as an ornamental stitch. Now, I think there's loads that you can say about that, but it helps, I hope, slightly support this point by claiming that if a stitch has been put together and it is ornamental, sorry, let me rephrase that. If a stitch has been used to sew something back together and it is ornamental, it is perhaps a pretty stitch, or it is a not unattractive stitch that stands out in a rather garish way. It is a stitch that has therefore been quite successful in sewing something together. And if all of this language is perhaps metaphorically suggesting she is sewing herself back together or repairing herself, then perhaps the reference to this at the end of the stanza rather implies, and indeed at the end of the poem, rather implies that her attempts to metaphorically sew herself back together and repair herself have been successful. So that is good. My paragraph would then carry on, however, by saying that this is in contrast to Remains, where any attempt to try and repair himself has not succeeded. So different to Poppies. And what's my evidence for that? The remainder of this point, everybody, really would hinge on the metaphor in line 18, where we hear of a blood shadow that stays on the street. Now, what is a blood shadow? Well, I put it to you, everybody, that is a metaphor for, I'm sorry to say, the blood that has been literally stained into the pavement. So unfortunately, pavements and concrete can absorb liquid. Generally speaking, they can absorb rainwater, but in war zones, I'm sorry to say that they can absorb blood. And in this case, it is the blood of the looter that he has shot. So number one, I can compare that to Poppies. My paragraph can carry on writing saying that this compares to Poppies because whereas we've got a fabric that can be easily manipulated, that can be ripped but also sewn back together, in Remains we have a similar sort of material, but in this case it's not a fabric that has been stained, it is a war zone that has been stained, much like a fabric could be. And in this case, we cannot get rid of the stain. So I hope you see where we're going with this, everybody. The metaphor of the blood shadow implies a stained material that cannot be easily washed away. And my paragraph would continue, everybody, by saying something that I hope you think is really clever, that the description of it as a blood shadow then allows us to really go on and analyse the use of the term shadow. Because what is a shadow? It's something that stalks you. It's something that haunts you. It's something you can't get rid of. It's something that, as I've said, follows you around. It's a faceless, silent, shapeless form that you just cannot run away from. And that, everybody, I hope is a really clever thing to say that really helps support your point that the protagonist in Remains has not been able to, as it were, repair himself. He is consistently haunted by his actions in shooting the looter. I hope that that's a really good comparison, but I could carry on. The fact that we hear the rounds tore through the looter, the use of the verb tore, again, compares surely really nicely with Poppies. It implies a damaged fabric. It's not like the bullets went through him or shot through him. It really helps us out with our comparison, everybody, by using the verb tore, to tear. It implies a damaged fabric, metaphorically, therefore, damage to the protagonist as well, which is unlike the language of repair above in Poppies. Really nice paragraph, that one, I hope. And the final point that I would make is written here under number 3. It's got a real focus on structure, this point. I'd suggest that the after effects of war in both Poppies and Remains promote a longing or an awareness of freedom in various ways. What's my evidence for that? Well, for Poppies, I would hope it's quite simple for Poppies. The fact that there is this free-flowing enjambment and a lack of a rhyme scheme really helps complement the idea of nostalgia, of, as it were, daydreaming, of, as it were, longing for the past, of just thinking out loud, perhaps. There is no restrictive nature to the structure of this poem. One can, as it were, drift as much as one possibly wishes to. And you may wish to make reference, I think, to a nice enjambment break here in lines 17 to 18, when we hear how her words turned into felt, break, and then a slowly melting. And I think that enjambment break combined with the verb melting gives you some good writing there to talk about a slow, gradual descent. Clearly, melting is a slow, gradual dissolution of a substance. So all of this, I suggest, shows that she's not restricted by a rhyme scheme. She's not restricted by a strict layout of her poem. And you can link that to the idea of after effects of war. It suggests you can write whatever you so desire here, that she is free of the trauma, or she's aware of the freedom and the and is able to escape from it, and that it will shortly come. More powerfully, though, I think you contrast this with Remains, which, like Poppies, has enjambment, which, like Poppies, I think does not have an especially strict rhyme scheme, but towards the end, the language becomes far more restrictive. The language towards the end has far greater connotations of inescapability and restriction. So what's my evidence for this, everybody? Well, I think the verbs blink, sleep, and dream suggest that he is really restricted in terms of trying to escape the trauma that he has encountered. The verbs blink, sleep, and dream clearly all have, or clearly all related to closing your eyes either for a short amount of time or a long amount of time. And no matter what he does, if he has his eyes open or if he has his eyes closed, he cannot escape the visions of what he has seen at war. That is surely related to being restricted to the current status quo. He cannot escape it. But I think more powerfully than that, everybody, is line 26, when just after we get that harsh consonance of the drink and the drugs that won't flush him out. And if I flush out an enemy, that's a military term for sweeping through a landscape and getting rid of all the enemy. We hear line 26, how the looter is dug in behind enemy lines. This, I think, really powerfully helps our point, because if the looter is dug in, clearly the looter has metaphorically dug a trench within the psyche of the soldier, and if it's dug into a trench, or he is dug into a trench, that rather implies it's going to be very, very, very difficult to get rid of. You cannot necessarily easily expel an enemy from a war if they're dug into a trench. It's their fortifications, it's their defence. But even worse than that, we hear that the looter is dug in behind enemy lines, and I would be analysing as well the use of the noun enemy, because it's almost as if the soldier has realised, well, if this soldier is dug into my mind and he's dug in behind enemy lines, then I am the enemy in this situation. I am the, so to speak, antagonist in this situation. And that, I'm suggesting, is quite a difficult thing to come to terms with. Clearly, that is very reflective and adding, I'm sorry to say, to the PTSD that the soldier has. Okay, I hope that's been helpful, everybody. Bye for now.